Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here in Quebec. Désolé, mon français n'est pas très bien, mais donc je vais parler en anglais. So I will be speaking in English today because my French is just okay there. So first, I want to open up that this presentation is designed so that you can take it back to your home country and then utilize it yourselves. There are notes within the presentation, and this is actually a much shorter version of my longer one because it's meant to be really given to students, those who are kind of on the brink of learning more about nuclear weapons and radiation so that they can become more interested in the topic and more active in the area, because as you can see in this conference, the majority of people are of an older generation, and we need more young people to get active and utilize our social media to make change. So this is what this presentation is meant for, to really get more people engaged, and I encourage you to please take it back to your home country, make adjustments as needed, to then show the link between maternal and child health outcomes associated to nuclear radiation exposure. So that's just my little foreground there. So today we're really going to be talking about ionizing radiation. Knowing who the people are here in the room, I don't really need to say how ionizing radiation can be quite harmful to health, that it's damaging to our DNA, it has the potential to mutate and cause lots of harm. So there are different types of ionizing radiation. The particulate styles first are alpha particles and beta particles. Then also the transmitted types of radiation are going to be gamma rays. And then non-nuclear derived radiation also comes in the form of cosmic rays and X-rays, and some of these are going to be more in the medical field that you'll see in your hospital versus like in your natural environment, living next to maybe a nuclear power plant or something. So radiation is very harmful, as we all know here. Some of the most susceptible populations are going to be the elderly, children, those with immune disorders, and as well women more than men is what studies have been showing. I'm really focusing on maternal health in children because that's my field. I'm currently a student at the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota, and it's the population I am most interested in since I feel like they're very vulnerable, and children also. They don't have a voice for themselves so much, in the legal realm at least. So it's our responsibility as health professionals to be a voice for them. So that's part of what this presentation is also about. So I have a question for everyone here in the room. What do you see that all of these individuals have in common? You can just shout it out. Male? Me. Yep.
Smiling.
They are all smiling. Oh, that's true, but not the point. Under 40, yeah, correct. They're 20s and 30s. There's one more key thing. They're all healthy. So this is the standard reference man that is used in research. Generally, healthy men, Caucasian, in their 20s and 30s. This is how we get our research. This is not accounting for different groups in the population, such as women and children. It's not accounting for minority status, like in the United States where I come from. Certain populations are more likely to have adverse health effects because of how their environment that they're growing up in, their education, things like that. So these here are the examples of the reference man that we see in our research. IPPNW, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, is making a push towards using the reference embryo. So here's a lovely image I like that they're using in Germany. That is the reference man, the big brown bear, and the reference embryo is a small one. They're pushing for the reference embryo in research because the embryo is the most vulnerable and the most unprotected during those developmental stages. So this is something that I urge you as a health professional or allied health professional to push for. If you're going to be involved with a research study, think about who is your other population. I know for my country, we have to go through many more steps to get to be able to research women or children, but put in that time, because once we have that information, we're able to utilize it, we're able to find the results, and we're able to have stronger information and data to back up policy changes. So I want to now focus more so on maternal and child health. So let's focus on the kids right now. Kids, they're adorable, right? They're also quite different from us. They're not little adults. Developmentally, when they're in the womb, they're developing at the fastest rate possible right now. They're developing their critical organs. Then when they're out, their size, they're small. They have a higher surface to volume ratio, they're touching more things. Their organs are going to be closer together. So like earlier we were talking about the different types of ionizing radiation particles. Once they're entered your system, the distance from the arm to the heart for a child is going to be shorter distance than for an adult. They're going to be more susceptible. Also, their internal defenses are still developing right now, so they're weakened compared to an adult who's been able to develop a stronger immune system. Further, children have unique exposure pathways. Their behaviors on how things can get into them are different through breastfeeding, the transplacental barrier when in the womb. Their environment is very different. How often do you see a little baby walking up to where we are? They're going to be down on the ground. They're going to be crawling around. They're putting things in their mouth. Think of where radon settles, more likely to be at lower levels than higher levels. We're not going to be licking that lead pipe, but children are. They're exploring. That's just part of their nature and development. Also, developmental stages as children, they're bigger risk takers than adults are. They're going through, like adolescents, for example, are going through that stage of I'm invincible. They're more likely to take higher risks and ignore signs that might say hazard waste site. So therefore, they are more likely to be exposed in certain ways. So who is most susceptible? The answer that through compiling various research studies in this project was finding that female children. And part of this is because for the female child, they're born with all of the eggs that they're going to have for their lifetime. During this time, that means they have many more years of exposure for those eggs to be exposed to radiation, while for sperm, that's going to be a different, less time exposed. So I know there's research studies on it. I'm sorry, I don't have the citation with me at the moment. So I also want to talk about, so I've been focusing on maternal and child health, but as you can see, there are men in this room as well, and men are definitely a big part of the picture. Men also play a role in they have a role in fertility. Their health is important. If their health is not well, I mean, for example, they're going to be ill with cancer at home or leukemia, they're not going to be able to have a job and bring home. Their quality of life is not going to be as good because they can't provide as well for their family or for themselves. Also, the social level, men are huge. As we just heard from Helen Caldicott, that men are in more leadership positions than women. That's very unfortunate, and that needs to change, but that is currently the reality. I mean, my country has yet to see a female president. So therefore, they have many spheres of influence. So I urge you, as the men in the room and as women here, push for that change. Make it people realize maternal and child health is also a men's issue. So I'm trying to push for that as well. So when we talk about different sources of radiation, I know whenever I go to an IPPNW conference, we're always very focused on nuclear weapons. We're focused on the nuclear facilities, waste sites. However, some of the things that we don't consider are the background radiation that we have regularly through our environment, as well as medical x-rays and treatments. So I'm going to kind of go through this quickly as I know our time is short. So this is from the 1982. As you can see, a large part of ionizing radiation exposure to the public is coming from radon. I'm going to let Michael talk more about that. As time passes on, we're seeing that radiation is really increasing the medical sphere. This is something that I think a lot of physicians are overlooking, so when this presentation is given to medical students especially, reminding them of when do you need to go give that MRI? When do you need the x-rays? I know at least within the US it's standard procedure. I'm not sure what it is like in other countries, but addressing those issues in your home country is important because this is where a lot of exposure is happening within more developed countries. This is just an example here of other places for exposures in the United States. We have many nuclear facility sites. I know within a 50-mile radius of each of these facilities, there's over 120 million people. So that's a lot of exposure if something were to go wrong, like in Fukushima. Around the world, there are over 400 current reactors that are operating, many more that are being proposed and planned and under construction. So we know the cost of that, and all that money could better be diverted toward health and education and environment. So I urge you, when you are speaking with your elected officials, speaking with other advocates, to push for that. Have a proactive message that we need to think forward for our health and our education and the environment. We need to move away from this energy source, which is not sustainable. For those of you who are unfamiliar, IPPNW has a great hibakusha map on their website. This is just a screenshot of it. I urge you to go check it out. You can see the different nuclear chain from uranium mining to transportation, disasters, and testing around the world, and pull this information for an area that's near your home country. So here are some of the studies that I had pulled together. I know these are very well known, and this again is a reminder. This is meant to introduce people into the field of nuclear radiation. The Beer report, one of the key findings there is showing that the linear no threshold model it's unlikely that it really exists there, and how radiation is having many other adverse health effects. This is another example of like how radiation, thank you. Other sources of radiation, where they're coming from in the environment, and that 1 in 100 people are likely to have that link from a radiation source. Granted, this is from 2005, and that there is hopefully going to be, there's the Beer report, there's a push for another Beer report hopefully coming soon, because the thing that I find very frustrating with the research is, it's 2015, we're using data, a publication from 2005, but the data from that came from probably the past decade prior. So also reminding your elected officials when you are trying to make a push for and talk about these issues that we can only use the data that's up to a certain point, and as time is going on, things are getting worse. And really using that voice of talking about the future and showing that we do have limitations in our science and evidence, but it's because we're trying to have good evidence, which is why I also want to push towards using things like the reference embryo. There's also then the meta-analysis that was looking at over 60 studies, and basically just showing that there are increased rates of cancer mortality rates closer to nuclear sites, which then goes into the KIC study, showing this is, sorry, it's been a while since I've done this. Sorry? Why, thank you. I've never been able to say that. But yeah, I was really looking at children, how there are higher rates of childhood leukemia closer to those sites. And that it just keeps increasing. However, then we come into the GeoCap study, and one of the key things that my advisor was showing me is that there's really no proportional correlation with leukemia and distance, because some of the things that we need to take into consideration that might not have been addressed in the limitations is, though you have a nuclear site and then you have that concentric circle looking at like the 5 kilometers like in the KIC study, think about where's the wind blowing, because when you think of like downwinders like in Nevada in the United States, think about where's the food source for these people. So there's some things that I want to draw your attention to that some of these studies could be lacking in, because when we do present evidence, it should be strong evidence. We don't want to undermine ourselves by missing some of those small details of realizing nuclear radiation, like, it's the environment. There are many things that impact the environment and health. And that it could be your food source, your water source, where is it coming from? Because you think of those children back in the KIC study, usually you're not always eating the food that's grown locally right around you. It's coming from different point sources. So take that in consideration before making very strong claims, because yes, those claims are very moving, but we also want to make sure that we're giving accurate information. So some of the challenges I've really found in the radiation field is, I'm still fairly new to it, is the language to me is still very confusing. We have different forms of measurement for measuring. Do you use the word dose or risk? Right now I'm working on a team in the US to influence our Environmental Protection Agency, and we've come to the conclusion that we really need to be using the word dose and not risk, just because the risk implies that, well, not everyone might be impacted, but dose is more measurable, and more measurable things can lead to more information. And then also when it comes to studies, this is one of the most frustrating things I found is, which studies do you trust? I was looking at some studies regarding 3 Mile Island in the United States, and the results were showing that it was not very impactful to human health, and I was shocked by that. And it was one of my colleagues who was pointing out to me that for these 2 women, Margaret Hatch and Evelyn Talbot, their funding came from the 3 Mile Island Public Health Fund, and they were restricted on who was allowed to be in their study. And so therefore, I'm reading a peer-reviewed journal article on results showing minimal effect from nuclear radiation from 3 Mile Island's disaster. This right now, as a young researcher, is very confusing for me, so this is something I also want to draw your attention to, especially when you're presenting this field to a younger population who's not very familiar with it, is you need to figure out who do you trust, whose resources, where's the money coming from. The nuclear industry in the United States, they fund a lot of things, and it's very hard to find out who is a trustworthy source, so I highly encourage you to investigate that further. The nuclear industry is also really well hidden, and laws are unclear, and this is very purposeful. As we all know, the nuclear industry, they are strong lobbyists. They have a lot of power, and therefore we need to come back with even more power and a larger voice, and we need to create critical mass to influence policy. Because once you create critical mass, once you create critical mass, those are the constituents who then vote for those elected officials. Those elected officials should be bound by the will of the people. Doesn't always work, there is corruption, but reaching critical mass is what's going to make change. So I want to again press that it's really our responsibility to make change. As you can see, as many of us here in the room are medical professionals, the rate of radiation, at least within Western countries, is growing in the medical field. We need to be aware of that, not only from the mining sources, from waste dumps, but also within our own hospitals and clinics. So there's different ways to make change. I especially urge you to get a young group of people activated. If you work with medical students, bring them all over to your legislator. So you can, therefore, talk with an elected official, have a really meaningful conversation. I know some folks here at the conference, they were on the same flight as their, who was it? Alfred, do you remember? It was Quebec, the governor? No, I forgot. The premier of Quebec, and they were on the same flight, and sat down and had a meaningful conversation. Those things are very memorable. So I encourage you, get outside of our normal circle, yes, because yes, it's great for us to inspire each other, but get outside of our normal circles. Talk to the people who don't know about these issues. Give this presentation in your home country, switch over to using the reference embryo instead of reference man, and collaborate across disciplines. I am not a physician. I am in this public health. And what I love about working with PSR, IPPNW is that we have allied health professionals. And in my work in my country, I've worked with environmental law firms to make changes on shutting down like our coal plants. I've worked with people who are skilled in communications because they can get a message across better than someone coming from my background or a medical background, because how often do you learn about advocating to a legislator in medical school? You don't. You're learning other things, which is very important as well. But collaborating across disciplines is very important for making change across the masses. So thank you for your time. My contact information is on here. I'd be very happy to give out the longer version of this presentation, which has more information on there, or the shorter version and talk to you more in depth later. So I think now we'll switch over to Michael.
I'm delighted to see all you here today at the World Uranium Symposium. My name is Michael Dworkin. Radon gas health effects. Silly me, I didn't put down that I'm also past president of Physicians for Global Survival and was once a representative of PGS to the IPPNW. So I'm very well rooted since the early 80s in anti-nuclear activities, or what I prefer to term as pro-peace and social justice, as opposed to anti-anything. Last week, in my palliative care practice, a 42-year-old man who was having significant pain and symptom management problems with lung cancer, metastatic to brain and liver, and he said, "I never smoked." I said, "Did you check your house for radon?" "I did. It's twice normal what's accepted." "Did you spend a lot of time in the basement?" "No, but my kids do." That's what makes me interested in the issue of radon gas. This is a highly prevalent issue that most people don't know anything about. Who in this room has actually tested their house for radon gas? Okay, it's a start. Hopefully after this talk, you'll all run out and buy a kit. My focus will be on residential, industrial kind of exposures, not mining exposures, limited to time. This radon resource kit came out from Health Canada, Radiation Division. Some of my slides come from there. And of course, it's immediately false because radon gas is not green. It's quite invisible, smells, no smell, no taste, quite innocuous. And that's one of the reasons why it's so dangerous. In this talk, we'll see what the sources are, how it's connected to the big picture in terms of our mandate here, uranium, and larger issues like nuclear war, and practical things on how to remedy high levels of radon gas in the home. So there it is. Radon is a radioactive gas, occurs naturally in uranium and soil and rock, breaks down, invisible, odorless, tasteless. Radon is released from the ground into the outdoor. It is diluted and is not a concern then, but when it comes into the house, it can be concentrated there. Thank you. And in closed space like homes, it can be quite high levels, and there are ways of measuring it to help. There we go. That's uranium 238. And we go down this cascade of various radionucleotides. And if I can get this pointer working, yes. We come to radon right there, but many of these other radionuclides are harmful and dangerous. Polonium, for example, is lethal in micrograms. Plutonium is even considered highly carcinogenic, but we're going to focus on radon. There's our famous alpha particle. Michel was very good to notify that particulate energies can be in this format. 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and if you can see, poor alpha can barely go through paper, never mind your skin. So you have to inhale it, you have to ingest it, and then it can be concentrated in tissues. You heard about bone marrow concentrations for certain radionucleotides. And in the lung, which is really the focus of radon, it causes continuous bombardment of a cell in the membranes of the lung, bronchial and peripherally, that can ultimately change the way the RNA in one nucleus happens. And the theory is that from that, it perpetuates a cancer, which takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years to grow. Beta rays can go through metal, gamma rays and X-rays concrete, as you can see there. So the significant health risks associated with exposure to high levels of radon it is a lifetime risk, and the risk of radon exposure, again, is dose related and is heavily influenced by smoking, which is some very interesting data. In fact, it was in the uranium mines in Germany in the last century, in the early 1800s, that they noticed people were getting lung cancer, and those who smoked, 10 times worse situation. So this information has been out there for a very long time. On the average, 16% of lung cancer deaths are attributed to radon in Canada. Estimated 1,900 deaths per year to radon exposure. It's the second leading cause for lung cancer, equal to secondhand smoke. So that's a staggering statistic. As a family physician working in primary prevention, I try to educate people to stop smoking, but not many of us are talking about radon gas in their home. This is particularly disconcerting when I work at the other end of my professional life as a palliative care physician and have to take care of dying cancer patients. Other than lung cancer, there's no evidence that radon exposure has any harmful effects on other morbidities such as asthma, cough, bronchitis, etc. It's strictly a potent carcinogen and a very significant one. Health experts sound alarm on radon. That's taken from a newspaper in 2004, but it says safe levels of gas in homes needs review. Canada has been very bad in this respect. It has had the highest level of acceptable radon most of the world, and needless to say, up until this point, because of international pressures, the United Nations, etc., till we changed our policy, and lo and behold, of course, we are the second biggest producers of uranium in the world. And so having high acceptable levels of radon gas was very convenient for the industry. So the question is, why was it changed from 800 becquerels per meter squared to 200 becuries per meter cubed, I should say. Health, since the early 80s and late 80s, original guidelines were based on estimate of lung cancers, looking at uranium miners and their levels. Uncertainty existed in the projection of these risks from occupational exposures to residential exposures. So here's a look at the big picture. So we went from 800 to 200 becuries per meter cubed. The World Health Organization has recommended 100 becuries per meter cubed. US, it runs at 150. The Europeans run between 200 and 400. Nobody can make up their mind. Well, basically, there are all kinds of political, economic pressures and uncertainty. But clearly, it is a definitive carcinogen. And again, depending on exposure and location and so on, and the way you measure these things. So it varies from country to country. So this is the picture in Canada. Again, another estimate, more recent, 20,000 deaths per year from lung cancer. So take 10 to 16% of that and works out to 3,000 excess cancer deaths from a reversible cause. And this is another look at the World Health Organization, looking more globally at various calculations. It's going to be hard to see this from the back, but the yellow area is 200 becuries per meter cubed and 800 two sections after. And it's basically comparative risk. So if we look at the green circles, that's all accident deaths combined. The yellow is aircraft bush pilots and their chances of dying from their activity. Climbing Mount Everest is another potential lethal activity, and poisonings. So these are relative risks compared to other activities. Now, there are not too many bush pilots here or people climbing Mount Everest, but I like this study because it's so curious in those respects. But what it really helps to identify everything around us has risk. Radiation, cosmic, we can't change that. We have the earth, what we eat. We have isotopes in our bodies that are continuously operating. And we've developed a way of surviving to a point. Michelle points out that infants, the fetus, these are the most highly risk ages where our sensitivity to radiation exposure is critical. Also, at the other end of life, as we become older, our immune systems cannot handle these changes when ionization radiation affects cellular damage, RNA, in the cells in ways that our immune system cannot handle it, and so a higher increase of cancers, age-specific. So here we go with the smoking. A is 20 or more cigarettes per day, less than 20 is B, C, non-smoker. So it's quite an interesting curve in terms of dose response and the criticality of smoking and relation to radon gas. There's some more of that. This is another way of looking at it. Smokers, 1 in 3 will develop lung cancer when exposed to radon gas, and this in a high radon situation in non-smokers, only 1 in 20. So that's the kind of variations that you can see as a confounder. Again, not too many children are smoking in the basement, thank God. Where are we looking at in terms of the science? You got a taste of it from Michelle's talk. The Bear 7 is the foundation of a lot of my reading in this area. But up until the last decade or two, there was always this sense that, well, there's always an acceptable level, this threshold effect, that you can have a certain amount of radiation, it's not a problem, and then it goes up according to dose. We know, too, now that there is no safe level. Any amount of radiation ultimately can be detrimental, and it's pretty linear in terms of dose. Many of the early studies were based on the Hiroshima-Nagasaki data. There's Hiroshima, and the study, in fact, is incorrect in part because it took 5 years before they even started measuring things. And then they started seeing the leukemias within 5 years, and the solid tumors like lung cancer into 10 and onward. And so we know there's this latency period, and that's part of the reason why uranium companies say, oh, has nothing to do with what we're doing. 10, 20 years down the road, people forget where that alpha particle from a radon exposure really came from. So the science is challenging. Ionizing radiation has not only age-specific effect, but organ specifics, so that thyroid glands are highly radio sensitive to ionizing radiation, and so are lung and bone marrow and ovaries and so on. The detail you can get later. But the message here is that this is external sources. So we were mentioning X-rays as being a potential problem. Thyroid cancers are growing exponentially in North America because of the overabundance of use of CT scans of the head and dental X-rays that improperly covered shields for the thyroid, and so we're seeing more thyroid cancer. Hey, but there's also Chernobyl and Fukushima and all that. The incidence of thyroid cancer is growing exponentially in that Fukushima disaster, and they're sort of inhibiting that information from becoming public. Another political decision to protect the public from panic. Well-informed people make the proper decisions. This is a radiomicrograph of my dear friend Bob Del Tredici, who will have some of his pictures here today over the conference, showing plutonium, but it's in a lung tissue, and it actually shows the alpha radiation spreading into the lung tissue. Fascinating visualization of what is happening on a cellular level inside the lung when somebody is inhaling radon gas. So, you may say that alpha radiation is about 20 times more effective in causing biological damage, leading to cancer, mutations, and leukemias. Beta radiation or gamma radiation per unit energy delivered in living tissue. 20 times, it's estimated, worse than those. It's like a subatomic bullet. Then an alpha particle can be described as this cannonball that it looks like it has no penetrating power, but it actually has a tremendous energizing force to create damage to the genetic materials that ultimately lead to mutation and carcinogenesis. Background radiation, we can't do much about that, but look, we have radon in the gas, in the water, in the air, in the buildings. These are the kind of proportions, and again, using other becquerels per day. This is what Michelle was alluding to. It's a disaster. The terminology, REMS, becquerels, res, you have to, you know that term? It ain't nuclear physics, but it is nuclear physics. It's highly complex, and if you try to get into the literature, the terminology can be overwhelming. Maybe that's part of why it's kept secret from the public and from reporters and the media. But the disasters in nuclear power plants has upped significantly background radiation globally. Let's not forget that. And it's going to continue to be a problem with Fukushima spewing out radioisotopes for hundreds and hundreds of years to come. Let's go back to your home. Phew, that was a bit scary. So here are ways and means radon can be distributed. Bedrock, fractured rocks, radon goes through the water, into the cracks through the floors, into the air through that way. It seeps in, dissipates, usually of low concentration, hopefully within the norms of acceptability. Here's another example of the green fearful things. A recent study actually looking at cement blocks. That's nice, but the cement is attached with mortar, and that mortar has tiny cracks, and radon can easily go through those cracks. I was asking Montreal, my concern, of course, where I live, what's the radon risk? And the public health people say, not a risk. We've done studies, not a risk. Meanwhile, my patient last week lives in Montreal, and a pulmonologist, where I'd give this talk to, because I think it's important for them to educate on radon gas. Only 5 people actually measured, and one of those 5 had excess levels of radon gas in his home. You can close your eyes to the reality, but it is there until you look for it. Let's go back to the big picture, uranium, and why we're all here today. Uranium is a natural occurring radioactive heavy metal present in extremely low concentrations all over the world. Soil, rock, and water exist in several configurations as isotopes. The most common is U-238, 99%, and the one that really is needed in nuclear power plants uranium-235. But incidentally, U-238 is what is seen in weapons-grade material that's used for the missiles and bunker bombs that you've heard so much about in places like Bosnia and Iran, Iraq, and so on, with also, when pulverized and destroyed and heated up, gives off alpha radiation. And the half-life of U-238 is, get ready, 4.5 billion years. So it'll never go away. So those tanks that are exploding, those kids playing in those tanks in Iraq are being constantly bombarded with alpha radiation. So even though we're talking about radon today, you can't look at the isotopes that led up to the creation of radon. And why, of course, 235 in sufficient concentrations, it can be enriched and fission chain reaction can occur, and as a result you can get a nuclear reactor forming enough heat to turn a turbine to make electricity, and that's a peaceful atom, whereas the atomic bomb weapons, you heard about this earlier from Helen Caldecott. And through our history in Canada, from the 40s and 60s, uranium was primarily used in nuclear weapons until we put a lid on it, but you heard it was our uranium that went into the Hiroshima bomb. It's a chemical toxin, heavy metal. The heavy metals themselves are highly toxic and carcinogenic, as you can read there, particularly kidneys, bone cancer, and leukemias. This is a very complicated map, but Gordon Edwards, one of my mentors in this work, created this is a look at uranium and uranium fuel chain mining, milling, power, and distribution all over Canada. We could have a Fukushima anywhere in Canada at any time because our 30-year lifespan for basically the practicality of having a nuclear power facility goes down over time because of an increased radiation effect. The pipes become too brittle, they'll explode, and so they have to be rebuilt every 30 to 35 years at the cost of billions of dollars. So you had that very nice presentation this morning about the lack of cost and effectiveness of going that route. We're looking at tailings. You saw this horrible, horrible situation in South Africa. Here's a taste of what's going on in Canada. Horrendous. And of course, on the land of our indigenous peoples. And they're the ones who are suffering from the radon exposure, the dust that spreads in the wind, in the water, in the wildlife. Here's highly radioactive waste. I just wanted to show you a few pictures. Our success story in Quebec, hooray, we closed down Gentilly 2. We said $2.5 billion is too much. That's how they keep radioactive waste. We still haven't figured out that, and it's going to cost billions of dollars to figure out a solution, if there is a solution. So far, it's being stored in these big containers, and nuclear fuel reprocessing leads to weapons proliferation and nuclear war, and that's Helen Caldecott's warning to us all. How to test radon in your home? I better go quickly. You can order it from any reputable department store online. They cost about $60. You have to know where to put it, in the basement, preferably in winter, so there's no draft, there's no windows open. It'll be concentrated there.
Some places are free.
Some places are free, okay. The issue of they have the short kind of measurements, which are really not adequate. At least a 3 to 6 month exposure would be ideal to get your radon gas measured. You have agencies who will do it for a fee, so you don't have to even think about it. But this is what saving lives is our mission. Raising awareness is our passion. That's the message for my talk. But Rudolf Virchow in 1882 or 62 said it quite poignantly. There are two causes of disease, pathological and political. The story of radon gas is a political issue. And you heard from Michelle, we have to become active, better active than radioactive. Let's keep uranium in the ground. Let's measure radon in our homes. We can create a nuclear-free future. Thank you very much.